Nor am I suggesting that hearing people should be excluded from everything in this model, not at all, just leadership. Hearing people can play a very useful role in technical assistance. Now, I'm very serious, and I would suggest an advisory board to give assistance in areas where deaf people have been unusually deprived. Deaf people have the disadvantage of having been educated with bad models for good education. For example, in many deaf schools and programs, discipline is either totalitarian and arbitrary or wildly permissive because the teachers and students often don't understand each other. Also, and this is through no fault of their own, and partly the problem caused by terrible state certification requirements, but teachers of the deaf are not required by these requirements to know a lot about child development or how to create vital, exciting programs for academic achievement. So therefore, deaf people who were educated in deaf programs have no models for creating really good and vital programs. Teachers of the deaf in every certification I know of are also not required to specialize in the academic subjects they teach, resulting often, for example, in certified teachers of the deaf having an obsession with English as their only qualification for teaching it. It might be a good idea to look completely outside of deaf education at some non-public schools, because public schools are themselves less than wonderful. I have experience with Quaker education and find the respect for academic excellence, the individual human spirit, and creative programming consistent with first-rate education. There's not a Basil reader in sight. Quakers also understand that a key component to education is learning how to learn, how to think for oneself so one can learn for oneself and live for oneself. But aside from searching and finding inspired views of educational programming, the program should be run by the deaf. I am also nervous about professional counseling and early intervention. Early intervention programs are proliferating like crazy, and what they do appears to make things worse. My fantasy is to have a hearing parent and a deaf adult run early intervention centers where only one skill is taught, and that is ASL. And the rest is modeling normal human interaction. I don't know how much ASL parents will learn. They don't learn much signed English now, but they might learn to look at their kid as a kid, and that deafness is another way of being human. I also think that 16 students in a class won't wash. Nor do I think it's necessary for a hearing teacher to always be with a deaf one. Aside from possibly being intimidating, I don't think it's necessary. My deaf son accesses hearing culture by virtue of being a well-read, literate American who lives in America. A deaf teacher with 8 kids sounds good to me. In addition, until we have learned how to teach English through ASL, there will always be bright, capable deaf students who must always learn through ASL. I remember distinctly a friend of Jesse's who described the digestive system to me in revolting detail, only to fail the test the next day because the test tested his English rather than his knowledge of our insides. I have 2 more suggestions. I suggest that any teacher who spends more than 5 minutes a day on the calendar or teaches anything more than 2 times be fined half his salary. In conclusion, I wish to thank these scholars for their masterful presentation and for the better future for our children that it promises. I wish also to suggest that the heart of the matter, deaf persons themselves and their identity as proud ethnics rather than clients, be the managers of this experiment. Only deaf persons can fill our children's spirits, and they surely can't do worse than we've done in educational achievement. Thanks.
Questions on the cards to the aisle. Somebody will go up and collect them. Or also, if you want, never mind writing them, just come up to the front and give your question in person. Anyway, I have to get out of the light so I can see. Going back down there.
Congratulations for bringing this topic up. It's long overdue. Thank you very much. Now today I feel very excited because I was born into a deaf family. I'm a third generation. I'm hard of hearing, but I'm still deaf. I learned English and so forth, and then I went to the Maryland School for the Deaf in Frederick, and I graduated from that institution. I know what it's like to grow up in a residential school before the 60s. I'm married, have a deaf husband, I have a son who's hearing, and that's fine, and we communicate well at home. I should have come to Gallaudet years ago, but I was chicken, I was afraid. I never came here until I separated, and I thought, well, why not come to Gallaudet? And I've had experience here as a student and graduated, and then a few years later, I went to graduate school. And I've been a temporary teacher here and a sign language teacher with different people. And then I've trained professionals here, faculty. I love my work. I love it. In the last 3 years, I've been teaching English 50. That's a very basic English course here for students who are having difficulty acquiring English. And I've felt really that they've wasted their time going to mainstream programs and so forth, utilizing signed English. They've lost out on so much. And now, using ASL, they comprehend, and it's time now to do something. It's a very serious issue. It's time to do some work. I know there are teachers here that support what I'm saying. And then, recently, I've been interpreting for a student who has a vision problem, and I see other difficulties in the classroom. It's really time for some action. It's been a long time. It'll take time to succeed, but it's time now to do something. Not tomorrow, please. Many thanks to the three of you.
Second question? Anybody? Please keep as possible.
I just have a question for the authors of this paper. There was a lot of talk about the home language. What do you consider the first language of a child who is deaf born into hearing parents' home? Any one of you could answer that question, please.
Dr. Liddell?
Yeah, it's our intention that the first language of a deaf child born into a hearing family would be ASL. We said that in the paper.
Come on up, please.
Didn't the question mean, what do you think now is the language of the home? Was that the question?
I guess my question is, how would ASL occur in the home
Oh.
with a hearing?
Well, I think that, yeah, that's a different question from what I thought it was. Let me go back and answer the first question, the question I interpreted it to be, which is that for any deaf child, our assumption, our position is that ASL, which is a natural language, a visual language, has to be the first language of a deaf child. That it has to be a natural visual language. And how that gets accomplished in a family where the parents are hearing and the rest of the family is hearing, by our proposal, is that there's a daycare component to this proposal. We understand that hearing parents are not going to become proficient in ASL fast enough, if at all, to give the infant and the young child the kind of language input that child has to have to acquire that language at the rate that we'd like them to and at the proficiency level we want. So the primary providers of that linguistic input have to be deaf adults in the daycare center. At the same time, we have a much more detailed component than we could outline here of family support, and that has to do with teaching, let's not use that word at the beginning, with helping hearing parents understand the ways in which they already communicate with their infant, that really in the beginning have nothing to do with language, that have to do with interaction and social emotional bonding and so on. They've got, in my experience anyway, as a person who's worked with hearing parents both in an educational program and in research projects, hearing parents have a lot of strategies available visually and gesturally that we don't now capitalize upon in our educational intervention schemes. So one thing is to show the parents what they already can do to communicate with their infant. And the other thing is to provide a tremendous amount of support for them and contact with the deaf community so that they begin to learn ASL. I think one of the things we have to remember is that we've never really given hearing people much of a chance to learn ASL, hearing parents. The assumption has been that they can't. And I think that we don't know that at all, and that if the proper support and the proper environment is provided, we can help them go a long way toward communicating with their child in the visual language that they need.
I just want to say one more thing that some of the comments today and Carol's comment just triggered. One of the responses we've been getting to this paper has been, well, look, we've had pretty bad luck getting hearing parents to learn C2 or other forms of signed English, and you can bet that it's going to be harder to get them to learn ASL, so really we should stay with signed English. Which the logic of which escapes me, since we're arguing about which language it is better for the parents not to learn. I think that many parents have not had an opportunity to learn ASL, partly because we haven't given it to them, as Carol said, but partly also because education, particularly the individuals, the professionals that parents come in contact with during the early years of their child's life mostly still think that there's something wrong if you have to resort to ASL. That the signed English system is the way it should be. If you have to learn ASL, there's still something wrong with it. And there still is a widespread belief that the early learning of ASL will hurt the learning of speech skills. And I think this is communicated a lot by a lot of the professionals that the parents come in contact with. So it's not clear that parents couldn't learn ASL. I think it's clear that that they've had no reason to.
Let me inject with a question from one of you written here. It says, the type of signing that proficient hearing signers use is PSE. Where does PSE fit in with the picture? Dr. Johnson?
We didn't talk about that, and I wish we had, but when you write a paper, you never think of everything. We showed it to lots of people, and somehow that just didn't come up. I think realistically speaking, we can't talk about truly fluent ASL use by a lot of hearing teachers. Many of us have been trying to learn ASL through various methods for a number of years and still find ourselves doing something that is not exactly ASL. What we do learn by studying ASL is how to understand ASL and how to sign in ways that, although they may not be grammatical, they're generally understandable. And although they may not be beautiful, have the potential to communicate a lot of information in a short time, as does spoken English to hearing kids, as does ASL if you have a deaf teacher to deaf kids. I think that's the key. I think that the expectations of the system for the teachers is really the issue here. The system of training teachers and the system of evaluating teachers does not value the learning of ASL. If you take Gallaudet as an example, teachers come here maybe knowing nothing about sign language. They're given 6 weeks of training in vocabulary, and they're expected to teach high-level college topics with 6 weeks worth of vocabulary. And not only that, the courses that they take don't teach them to understand ASL. And not only that, after they pass the SimCom test, which many of you have had the pleasure of seeing, they're never essentially tested again. The SimCom test stays the same. So there's no approach to higher skill. If, on the other hand, we were to talk about the training of teachers in ASL, the training of our students at Gallaudet, the hearing students in the graduate programs in ASL, it's true that even years after they began their training, they would still have funny accents. They would still sign like hearing people sign. But they would be approaching some goal of excellence that had to do with ASL. And I hesitate to call that PSE. We could discuss that all day. But I think that's what you would expect hearing people to be using. And I think the secret is fluency. The ability to understand ASL and the ability to communicate things rapidly and well.
Where's Jeff? Jeff recently was up for a question. Still here?
Who do I have to look to? Okay, fine. My name's Jeff Rosen, and I think this discussion is long overdue. I'm glad it's been put on the table, and I think the research department has there are a lot of deaf people who have grown up and need the services better, and I'm really glad to see this kind of event being brought up through the Research Institute. I'd like to make some closing remarks. I have a question for you. I've read through your study. Some other linguistic studies and cognitive studies under Greenberg, who was very involved in this area of study. Really, essentially my reading, this is new clothing for an old idea. And the key to the success of the study would be two points. The way that the study is conducted and the prominence of the three people who are proposing it. The impact of this study would have to involve deaf individuals, researchers, writers, and so forth. I think this is the responsibility of the Research Institute to be cautious of that. People who are doing research in the area of AIDS don't have to have AIDS themselves. I think what's essential is advocacy or advocating the concept or the idea of this work. To make it effective, people, as Claire did years ago, Gallaudet didn't speak for Claire, Claire spoke for himself. That's the second point I'd like to have focus on the methodology of the study. I think there's a little weakness in the methodology. I'm not looking into it in depth, but I think the research needs to be bolstered by the addition of a larger study. I think in New York City, Asian people have fought the school system to get primarily Asian language taught in the schools. And the same has happened for Hispanic people. I think we need to sort of base some of our efforts on those models. We can also benefit by a long-term study with the deaf community. Have there been any follow-up studies in the deaf community?
Dr. Patton, I believe, has to leave to catch 7 o'clock plane, California, so.
I'm teaching tomorrow morning at 11:30, so I need to leave.
Anybody want to respond to comments, questions from Jeff?
In the paper, that, as Scott said in the beginning, this paper grew out of a request that we are making to a large nearby unnamed state for permission to set up a program like this in a school. And this paper was intended to be the argumentation for the proposal itself, the support for the proposal, and the backbone of the proposal. The proposal itself is a separate thing, which we have not added to this paper because it's still in negotiation with the large unnamed state. We're hoping that they go for it. We don't know if they will. But one of the features of our discussions from the very moment we started talking about this, from the moment we got the opening to go to visit the state board, was that the direction of the program in the school has to have deaf leadership. And while it's true that you don't have to have AIDS to study AIDS, and you don't have to be deaf to study deaf people, I think maybe it's the case that you do have to be deaf to be the person who guides a program like this in its inception, and probably later. I think that there are things about being deaf that no hearing person can ever understand, whether they live with deaf people, whether they have deaf children, and so on. That's just a part of experience that they can't understand. And I would like to see that experience built into the program, and that was part of our goal from the beginning. As far as the research, we view this as a research-driven idea, okay? I find it somewhat ironical that the criticism from the mainstream educators of our proposal is that we don't propose research. Where is the research on total communication? Where is it? It doesn't exist. The research is is virtually impossible to find. Where is the research on C2? It's very sparse. What we wanted to do is build a program in which research would be the second major part of the component. And for that, we were also proposing a deaf researcher. It would be longitudinal research. Our proposal would go over 10 years, and we would watch a program develop during that time. It would have to take into account linguistic research, cognitive development, socio-emotional development, and so on. So, although the paper presents just the bones of a system, we have some somewhat more complete ideas, although all they are at this point is ideas. What we need is the chance to get together a team of people who really want to do this, a bunch of people who want to work as hard as it will take to recreate deaf education and make it happen, and that's what we're hoping we get the chance to do.
I just want to add one more thing. The part of the proposal that wasn't included here, the first year of this 10-year study is one full year of planning. And during that time, there would be an advisory board that would be gotten together with people with various types of expertise. We certainly don't believe that we're qualified or even want to develop this model program and flesh it out by ourselves. So this is the structure, and then we would spend a year working with this advisory board and the two deaf people who would be chosen to be the director of the program and the research and evaluation person would be brought on board right away to work in that planning year.
I'd like to commend the three presenters for putting this stuff in paper and in print. I don't necessarily mean that we're going to find the answer to deaf education, but I think that we're going in the right direction. We'll be moving in the right direction. There are several things that do concern me in the paper. First of all, well, let me step back. Bilingual education. Teaching using Spanish and English and so forth, different approaches to education in bilingual education. We have to remember that there are two modes being utilized, written on paper and verbal communication, whereas in deaf education, if we use ASL exclusively, there's no reading and writing. That's not equivalent. So in my mind, I was a little concerned that for a model program, there should be proposed as well ASL utilized as the primary mode of communication for grades 1 through 12, and that's what bothers me. I don't have any disagreement in starting early with ASL, so that concepts, cognitive thinking and development and so forth. But then somewhere along that line, somewhere before 12th grade, we have to change into English as the primary mode of communication. But of course, we would utilize ASL all the time. It would be a mixture of ASL and English. So I'm asking you, do you think we should use the ASL as the primary mode of communication? And then I'm equally concerned, what is ASL? That's my second point. People have different understandings of what ASL is. Ironically, I think that in C, there's a lot more signing than fingerspelling, so they come up with signs for minute inflections and portions of English. So they have a sign for it, for example. So those are the two questions that I think we have to look at carefully in executing this model program.
I keep looking at my two friends here, and they point back at me, so I get to stand up and answer all the questions. You will notice that we do not call this a bilingual education. I think if we want to learn from the experience of bilingual education in this country, we can learn a few things. One is that it generally works better than English immersion does. Two is that the approach to bilingual education in this country is typically what they call subtractive bilingualism. The goal being to start where a child starts with two languages and loses one, namely Spanish, Cambodian, Vietnamese, never English. And that isn't our goal here. Thirdly, in all instances of other bilingual education in the United States, children are born with access to two languages. They can hear English and they can hear Spanish, or they can hear English and they can hear Cambodian. Okay, that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is children who are born and cannot hear English. Remember, they're deaf. So, our proposal is not bilingual education in the purest sense. It's education that would create people who are bilingual, not take advantage of the fact that they're bilingual and get rid of one language. So our goal is essentially monolingual education in ASL, particularly in the beginning. Now, you can argue up one side and down the other about when to introduce English. And I have to say, I don't know what the answer is because nobody's tried it. We know that deaf kids with deaf parents learn a lot of English in the home, and they learn it pretty early. So it's quite possible that you could start using English pretty early. But kids are not born ready to read. And since the primary objective or the primary vehicle for the learning of English in what we're proposing is literacy, that particular fact may need to be delayed. That is, we can't talk about both languages coming in right away. At least I think so. I'm willing to argue about it. I don't know. I have to admit I don't know. The issue about how much English gets put in upper grades, one of the models of bilingual education says that you start with all Spanish, and over the years Spanish goes down to nothing. And what replaces that is you start with no English, and over the years English goes up to lots. So that by the time you're in 12th grade, everything is English and nothing is Spanish. Well, again, we're stuck with the same problem, and that is the view that SSS is English. It creates a difficulty. What would the English be? Our view is that English, in fact, will become increasingly important over the years, but that's because the learning from textbooks becomes increasingly important over the years in American education. The learning from books. And English is the language of our books. It never will be ASL. So we view the importance of English increasing, but still through literary means. And we have a great deal of difficulty accepting the notion that you can all at once start signing C and have it mean any more than the example that we showed you. That's what C looks like. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say C. That's what SSS looks like. It doesn't matter which system you use. In our experience, that's what it looks like. And it doesn't matter if you take a new teacher or if you take an old teacher. It looks that way. So I would caution you against using the word bilingual education. We're talking about ASL as a native language, and that's the primary goal of what we're talking about.
We only have 2 or 3 minutes left. You want to say something? Sure.
I have a few questions related to that comment and what Harvey just said, because at first, I'm not sure how you can say that children don't learn English through C when we have evidence and research to prove that they do. Secondly, I'm curious also how you define ASL, because would you label what Harvey was using ASL question, or more related to PSE? Because what about the study by Brazel and Quigley, who found that deaf parents who signed PSE, their children had better English skills than the deaf parents who signed ASL? So I don't quite understand how we define ASL, and what the criteria will be for deaf people who work with children. Would you forbid deaf people from using PSE? I'm real confused on that area.
Maybe one final question.
I'm gratified that I have the opportunity to ask a question. I want to thank you all for raising this issue. I read through the paper. I thought it was fantastic, and I was looking for something that was missing. I thought evaluation. I looked at other school systems. They use speech and language. They evaluate speech and language, and there is criteria, and there are ways to evaluate it formally. It's not as efficient as maybe SL, but I'd strongly suggest that or recommend that an ASL evaluation be included or incorporated into the implementation of this project.
I'm sorry, I think we need to stop now. If you want to stay and chat with some of these people, I'm sure they may be willing. But do you have one final comment, Dr. Benton?
Yes, just a final thought in listening to the discussion, the questions and comments. A suggestion to the people who developed the paper. First, I don't think you'll really find resistance from education of the deaf. I think the state of education of the deaf in America is educators are frightened. I think we think of schools for the deaf.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, pardon me. If we think of schools for the deaf, the old model, the residential schools for the deaf in America is in deep trouble. Many of them are simply hanging on. They're totally immersed in problems of survival. I don't think educators of the deaf in general are going to resist the kind of model program you put forth. And I would welcome an opportunity to work with you to discuss it in detail. I do have a concern about the place of the family, and I think what we know about child development suggests to us that the most rapid, most progressive, and most permanent change in the learning and development of a child comes when there has been a change in the understanding and behavior of the family. I strongly encourage you, as you further develop this model program, to find ways to include the family and consider what education has done down through the centuries, and that is to reach the mind, the intellect of the child through the people who rear him. And I think it's critical that we not do things that are going to diminish the value of parents in their own eyes, because parents of deaf kids, hearing parents, feel diminished enough as it is. And my final thought is that we together move forward from this landmark achievement in open discussion. This could not have happened 25 years ago, and I've been sitting just pinching myself all afternoon to realize that we've come this far. But let's not kill the goose that laid the golden egg, or let's not forget how we came to where we are. And I make a plea for the kind of unity that's never before been quite as possible in deaf education as it is today. A real union, a permanent union between the minds and hearts of people who are deaf and those who hear and work with them. We all share the same community of thought and the same vision for the future and the same dreams. Now the opportunity to realize those is closer than it probably ever has been. I applaud you. I'm happy to work with you.
I'd just like to second Dr. Denton's call for inclusion of the family in this whole procedure. I think that it's our belief that this type of program, instead of separating parent from child, will be the very thing that can bring hearing families with deaf children together. We're providing, I think, a tremendous amount of support to the hearing parents in the beginning. We've listed on page 20. We've got parent support groups. We have weekly deaf community contact with foster grandparents and the family, not just the child. Family education and counseling, because hearing parents need to understand what their feelings are all about. They've got a tremendous mix of feelings when they discover they have a deaf child. This is all going to, in our view, bring the family and the child, the family and the educational establishment, and the family and the deaf community together in a way that's never been possible before.
First, I'd like to close the proceedings by asking all of you to help me thank the participants for coming and sharing this information with us. this should not be the final word on this topic. I hope that the discussions about this will continue throughout the term and beyond that. I hope that each of you in your own departments, your own units, will further discussions in the ways appropriate to what you do on a daily basis. This does not have to be your final word. The Research Institute will be publishing in the summer another working paper, and that working paper will incorporate many of the things that were said today, and also will include other comments that you send to me. So I invite your comments. I've already gotten a stack on my desk that of very interesting things which need to be shared with the community. So thank you very much. And there is one final housekeeping word. I was told by email today that President Jordan's State of the University speech has been postponed to March 1st. So further word will be forthcoming. Okay, thank you very much.
So Terry, everything going okay?